Good afternoon, EDH enthusiasts. I'm Flynn of the Planeswalker Project, and welcome to a commander discussion video. Chatterfang Squirrel General has been in a lot of ways my signature commander ever since his release in 2021. After years of me begging for a legendary squirrel, we not only got that legendary squirrel, but one that cares about squirrel creatures. Sorry, Tusky. Chatterfang is a 3/3 Squirrel Warrior for 2 and 1 green with Forest Walk. Whenever you create one or more tokens, you create that many tokens plus that many 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens instead. Lastly, you can pay 1 black mana and sacrifice any number of squirrels to give a target creature plus X minus X until the end of turn, where X is the number of sacrificed squirrels. This card has been proven to be quite a surprisingly open-ended commander, which is likely why I've been so obsessed with brewing around it. We have a number of ways to build a Chatterfang deck, and I'd like to think that my personal build is rather unique compared to what others use. In this video, I'd like to take you through a few different builds that I've utilized in putting together my personal Chatterfang deck, and hopefully inspire you to build your own unique take on this deck. We'll begin with the classic Aristocrats. This tried and true build for Chatterfang utilizes death trigger focused strategies. I would say that of the builds that we will discuss today, this has the highest ceiling of them, simply because it aims to win quickly with little meandering and little subtlety. If you're looking to take your Chatterfang deck to higher power levels, this is likely the route you'll want to take. One of the main combos we aim to assemble here is Chatterfang, Squirrel General, and the Pitiless Plunderer. The Plunderer is a 1/4 human pirate for 3 and 1 black with 1 triggered ability. Whenever another creature you control dies, you create a treasure token. Because Chatterfang ensures that every token created on your battlefield comes with its own personal squirrel friend, that treasure token you create off of the Plunderer also comes with a 1/1 squirrel token. What this introduces is not quite an infinite combo, but an infinitely repeatable means to clear up any creatures on your opponent's battlefield, all available at instant speed. You sacrifice the treasure token to create 1 black mana, and you sacrifice the 1/1 squirrel. You then give an opponent's creature +1/-1 until the end of turn. The Plunderer sees the squirrel token die and creates you a treasure token. Chatterfang sees the treasure token being created and creates you a 1/1 squirrel, and you're then able to repeat this sequence again and again until your opponents no longer have creatures in play. This will give you a great many death triggers, from your own creatures dying to your opponent's creatures dying from the repeated +1/-1 buffs. You can build onto this interaction with any number of additional Aristocrats cards, such as the Blood Artist, Zilliport Cutthroat, and Mirkwood Bats, and you can deal a tremendous amount of damage to your opponents by repeatedly sacrificing your tokens. I personally prefer the latter two in this context, as they will deal damage to each of your opponents, rather than the Blood Artist pinging a singular target. The trade-off is that they will only trigger off of cards on your battlefield, whereas the Blood Artist will trigger off of any creature dying. You can also utilize the treasure tokens being sacrificed as Aristocrat fodder by means of the cards Marionette Master and Marionette Apprentice. The former is a 1/3 human artificer for 4 and 2 black mana. It has Fabricate 3, and when it enters, you can choose to either put 3 +1/+1 counters onto the master, or create 3 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. Whenever an artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to the Marionette Master's power. Marionette Apprentice is 1 and 1 black mana for a 1/2 human artificer with Fabricate 1, which lets it enter with either a 1/1 counter on it or a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. This is far more powerful and cheaper to cast, making it the better option of the two, as it comes down earlier and is more widespread in its damage output. See, even though the tokens cease to exist upon their being sacrificed, they do still hit the graveyard momentarily, triggering these cards' abilities. You can also include other sacrifice outlets, such as the Phyrexian Altar, a 3 mana artifact with an activated ability. Sacrifice a creature and add 1 mana of any color. This can in many contexts work better than simply using Chatterfang's sacrifice ability, as you can then produce infinite colored mana by sacrificing your squirrels over and over again. The Plunderer will create the treasure token, which you can keep in this line, and Chatterfang replaces the sacrificed squirrel. This sequence technically produces infinite colored mana and infinite treasure tokens, which you can then use to progress your board state. You can also use Warren Soul Trader, a 3 mana 3/3 goblin zombie wizard with a single activated ability. You can pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature to create a treasure token. This is in some ways a combination of both Chatterfang's ability and the Pitiless Plunderer, except it costs 1 life instead of paying mana. This can also go infinite technically with Chatterfang out, though you would need to run some means to recover the life you're losing by paying to activate the ability. Any Blood Artist style ability would suffice, as they gain you life when your creatures die. When looking for cards to fill this space, any free sack outlet would be great. Something like Sadistic Hypnotist can even be a tremendous detriment to your opponents, as you have a free sack outlet that will force opponents to discard cards from their hand. If you use this as your sack outlet, not only will you be impacting your opponent's life totals with your Blood Artist family, but the Hypnotist will leave opponents top decking if they survive. This can be a brutally powerful strategy to lean into, as opponents will be hard pressed to find an out. Board wipes don't work quite as effectively here, as you can include cards such as Living Death to bring back your key pieces, and since you're an Aristocrat deck, you'll want your creatures to die anyway. In the Aristocrats build, you don't necessarily need to run too many Squirrel cards outside of Chatterfang, even the token producing cards. You can devote more slots in this case to additional card draw, ramp, and tutor abilities. These will help you see more of your deck and speed up your game plan. Your mana curve is crucial in this build, as your best cards are low enough to the ground in terms of their mana value. A lot of my better lists of Chatterfang are on a very low mana curve, and so we don't really need a tremendous amount of mana acceleration to really get going. The standard assortment of mana rocks and a few other ramp spells should suffice, and so I've prioritized adding in more cards that will draw me more cards. Something like Species Specialist can go into a great many lists featuring Chatterfang, and while I'll still choose Squirrel in this context despite not actually running many Squirrel cards, the Squirrel tokens created by Chatterfang can then be converted into card draw off of the Species Specialist as we sack them repeatedly. See, you can accelerate your mana all day, but if you run out of cards in your hand or ways to refill your hand, what was it all for? This was a lesson that I've learned in building this deck, and is something that I think should be considered for the folks at home brewing their first commander decks. Card draw is essential to ensuring your game plan can continue, and my personal build runs between 12 and 15 card draw spells. Now, this specific build does edge closer to the realm of competitive EDH, though I would not by any means consider it a deck close to the CEDH range. It has potential to be a higher powered deck, and it does have the capacity to be very consistent, but if you're looking for a more casual build in a less cutthroat setting, our next variant may be more suitable to your needs. Rather than using your tokens as sacrifice fodder, you can choose to simply go wide with your tokens and use various means to produce additional creature tokens. Your opponents will only have so many creatures to block your Squirrel army, and so this is our next variant for Chatterfang. See, Chatterfang functions as a parallel lives of sorts, giving you additional tokens whenever you create tokens, though the ones he creates are still Squirrels. Still, extra bodies on the battlefield are always a bonus, and you do have the previous mentioned enchantment as a great option to double up the tokens you create even further. We have a number of combos that can easily go infinite to create trillions of creature tokens. But why make trillions when we could make billions? I digress. The iconic combo for this deck uses Earthcraft and Squirrel Nest. This combo is rather simple, and it's very well known among Squirrel enthusiasts. You use Squirrel Nest to enchant a basic land, which you can then tap to create a 1/1 green Squirrel creature token. Earthcraft is a generic enchantment that has an activated ability. It lets you tap an untapped creature you control to untap a target basic land. You untap the land enchanted by Squirrel Nest, at which point you can then repeat the sequence endlessly. This creates you infinite Squirrels, though they will largely be tapped in order to use the Earthcraft's ability. But you'll have an army of Squirrels ready to overrun an opponent on the following turn. If you have Chatterfang in play, you'll have friends that came with those tokens that are untapped. Another easy to use combo for this build is Scurry Oak and the Ivy Lane Denizen. The Ivy Lane Denizen has a triggered ability whenever another green creature enters, letting you put a +1/+1 counter onto a target creature. The Scurry Oak has Evolve, giving itself a +1/+1 counter whenever another creature enters with greater power or toughness than the oak. Whenever a +1/+1 counter is placed on the oak, you may create a 1/1 Squirrel. This is a May ability, which is important to remember, as we can trigger the Ivy Lane Denizen again, putting that new +1/+1 counter onto the oak. This will trigger the oak, and then we create a 1/1 Squirrel. That Squirrel will trigger the Denizen, and we can repeat this sequence endlessly. But since the Oak's ability is a May ability, we can choose to stop at some point, which allows us to end the loop when we've gone enough. If a card does not offer you the choice of whether you want to create the token via the May ability, your combo is an uncontrolled infinite combo and will result in the game ending as a draw. From here, we can even include other token generators, such as Herd Baloth, who can be a fill-in for the Squirrel, though it creates 4/4 beast creature tokens instead of 1/1 Squirrels, or Scute Swarm, who has a landfall trigger, creating a 1/1 insect. Once you have 6 or more lands in play, you will create tokens that are copies of Scute Swarm, which will then multiply exponentially as you trigger it further. Rampaging Baloths is another landfall trigger that creates a 4/4 beast. You can also utilize cards like Champion of Lambholt, who gets larger for each creature that enters our battlefield and also makes our creatures increasingly more difficult to block. Beastmaster Ascension in this deck can at times be unnecessary overkill, especially if you've achieved infinite creature tokens, but giving your board +5/+5 after 7 counters accumulate on the enchantment can give you a proper power boost. The endgame of this build is largely combat centric. Once we've gotten a large enough army, we can simply turn them sideways and swing in to end the game. Unless our opponents are also on a token strategy or have a wrath effect waiting, it will be nearly impossible to stop our hordes of tokens. We can even throw on an overrun ability or something like Triumph of the Hordes if you want to be really cruel to really seal the deal. I'm personally quite partial to Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Filth, which makes every land in play part swamp and gives our board of creatures swamp walk as long as we control a swamp and filth in the graveyard. Long story short, our creatures all have become entirely unblockable. That spells trouble for our opponents who are facing down our zillions of tokens. This is one of my more favorite variants of this deck, as I'm a sucker for token decks. But maybe you would like to go an even more relaxed and fun route with Chatterfang. After all, kindred squirrels are finally a legitimate strategy, right? Kindred strategies are always a fun way to build a commander deck. There are plenty of cards in Magic that give you boons from playing creatures that share a creature type, and squirrels are no exception to this. Chatterfang's ability doesn't inherently support squirrels besides creating squirrel tokens, but we can take the concept of a squirrel kindred deck and run with it. At the time of recording, we do only have 9 printed cards with Squirrel as the creature type, though we have 19 cards that have the Changeling ability, which makes them technically Squirrel creatures. We also have the forthcoming Bloomburrow set, which has a Squirrel-themed commander precon deck in our colors that will likely introduce us to a few more furry friends. I would like to say that this particular variant will gain quite a bit more support after that set's release, as we will have many more printed squirrels, and I'll likely revisit this later on after Bloomburrow. But for now, we do have a few good squirrel creatures that will give us a ton of value, and you could, in theory, cram every creature with the squirrel creature type or the changeling ability in to build a deck. You could also utilize some elements of the previous strategies as a supplement to a kindred strategy. Something like Maskwood Nexus does turn every creature you have into a squirrel, and then you can tap to create a squirrel. I just wish they were cuter and more furry. Ravenous Squirrel has abilities that synergize nicely with Chatterfang and Aristocrat strategies in general, getting a +1/+1 counter whenever you sacrifice an artifact or a creature. You can also pay 3 mana and sacrifice an artifact or a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. This is one of the core Squirrel cards that, regardless of your chosen build, should be considered for your deck. It's 1 mana that can be paid with either green or black mana, and so it's immensely flexible. Squirrel Sovereign and Metallic Mimic make for good 2-drop Squirrel Lord creatures, giving a power and toughness boost to your other squirrels. Those 1/1 tokens that you'll be creating for this strategy will be 3/3s, and with the multiple ways of buffing your board, the larger your squirrels become, the greater your threat that you pose to the table. Toski, Bearer of Secrets, is a 4 mana, uncounterable and indestructible squirrel. He has to attack each combat if able, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This is another cornerstone staple for your squirrel build, as each creature connecting to an opponent will draw you yet another card. Again, going back to what we said early on in this video, card draw will always ensure that you don't run out of steam and that you can keep playing your spells during your turn. Chitter Spitter is perhaps the strongest support card in a squirrel deck at the time of recording. This 3 mana artifact has a few abilities that offer a huge amount of value. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice a token, and if you do, put an acorn counter onto the chitter spitter. Squirrels you control get +1/+1 for each acorn counter on chitter spitter. Lastly, you can pay 1 green and tap the chitter spitter to create a 1/1 green creature token. Lastly, you can pay 1 green and tap the chitter spitter to create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. This lets you trade in any of your tokens, be they creatures, treasures, or what have you, to slowly accumulate acorn counters, which can then make all of your squirrels larger. I like to use the token I generate with it to sack the next turn to make the following squirrel that we create bigger. This also buffs non-token squirrels, and so your entire board can just grow larger and larger with this out. We also have our 3 Squirrel Lord creatures, who are not themselves squirrels, but do stuff for the theme. Deranged Hermit, Deep Forest Hermit, and Draykeeper, who each enter with a few squirrel tokens on their own, offer either a static anthem ability or an activated ability that gives buffs. These are all very strong cards and are part of the core of squirrel cards that I choose to include in all variants but the Aristocrat build. Now ironically, this build does not utilize Chatterfang as much as the other variants, though we do have a decent amount of token generation that Chatterfang of course can enhance. He's a squirrel and he can benefit from the other squirrel buffs, but him being in play is not as crucial to the strategy as with some of our other decks. But what if we wanted to take a route that went all in on Chatterfang? A rather unorthodox variant that the Chatterfang deck can go is the Voltron route. This is a slightly less common to see these days, largely due to the shift in commander deck building strategy, moving away from commander damage wins in favor of combo or accumulated value wins. Chatterfang is, after all, a 3/3 with Forest Walk, and that's an ability that I feel doesn't get as much attention as the token-producing one. But this can too be a strong route to go. Forest Walk is a potent evasion keyword, meaning that if the defending player has even a single land that is even part forest, Chatterfang is entirely unblockable, which is always bad news for opponents on a commander. It takes 21 points of commander damage to knock a player out of the game, and so with Chatterfang being a base power and toughness 3/3, we will want to make him larger to shorten that clock. You can easily turn his Forest Walk online with something as simple as a crop rotation, sacrificing a random land to bring out the Yavi Maya, the Cradle of Growth, and then turning every land into forests. Seems pretty easy. With this build, we do want to prioritize removal, interaction, and card draw, and some of the more optimal tutors. I'm generally not one to run many tutor spells these days, but in a game where we need to be all in on our commander, we want to ensure that we can get the proper cards for specific situations. We can lean into the various swords of X and Y to give Chatterfang added protection against defending player colors, giving him a power and toughness boost, and a plethora of other abilities. We have plenty of equipments like Power Fist that can put +1/+1 counters onto Chatterfang, making him stronger as he beats up our opponents. A Voltron build will run fewer creatures due to our reliance on Chatterfang to give us board presence. You can of course include other powerful creatures who can possibly get in some damage in the event that Chatterfang becomes inaccessible to us. See, Voltron decks can occasionally struggle against interaction. If your commander is removed from the battlefield and you must recast it, you might find that this becomes more difficult after the second time or so. Thus, it's important to make sure that your equipment gives you the resilience to not be phased when board wraps come to rush you out. Indestructible, Protection, and Hexproof are great options, but your choice of equipment spells and auras are entirely up to you and your preferred tastes. Speaking of preferred tastes, you can also find silly or unique themes to add to your deck to make it more tailored to your playstyle. In the past, many squirrels were printed on the silver border in the multiple unsets that we've gotten. As such, they were not technically legal for commander play, though they have a great deal of humor that was entirely on brand for me. So needless to say, if I were able to build a commander deck that can include any amount of these comedic elements, I'd be a happy camper. But in Infinity, the more recent of these sets, we got several cards that were black bordered and legal for commander play. They weren't super serious cards by any stretch of the imagination, but they were fun and interesting design spaces that intrigued me. Specifically, the attraction card type introduced brought about a really quirky way to play commander, and I think that their being grossly underplayed makes them an oddity to see at tables. Players don't often understand how they work, though they do make for some value that I can take advantage of in my deck building. as such, this would give me a route to building a commander deck that was entirely different from what most people expect out of a Chatterfang deck, and make it pretty unique to my own personal preferences. Without feeling like I was shoehorning this arbitrary strategy into my Chatterfang deck, we actually do have a card to tie into the attractions. Squirrel Squatters, who is a squirrel that opens an attraction upon your entering, and later creates 1/1 squirrels for each attraction you visited this turn. Now, when you open an attraction, you put the top card of your separate attractions deck onto the battlefield. During your main phase, you can roll a d6 to attempt to visit your attractions. Whatever the result you roll determines what attractions you get to visit. The lamps on the right side of the text box of these cards indicate what results you need to trigger them, and so having a wider variety of lamps lit means you have a greater possibility to visit at least some attractions each turn. This grew into a large theme in my deck, and I find it really engaging and an inspiring way to approach this deck. It's always exciting to start putting them into play, and while there are a handful of cards in the deck that do things pertaining to the attractions, because of how I built my deck, some games we lean more into the tokens and aristocrat stuff, and other games we're off to the Ashtratorium. I choose to include cards that give me value, such as merry-go-round, Ferris wheel, information booth, roller coaster, and others. There are quite a few different attractions, and among individually named ones, we have several options that have different lamps lit, allowing you quite a bit of flexibility in your choice. The rules of the attraction deck is that it must contain at least 10 cards and no 2 cards have the same written name. I chose some specifically to get more number representation so I don't always flub a die roll, and then others I chose simply because I thought the flavor text was funny. I'm very particular and consistent in my decision making, I'll thank you very much. These cards do involve a fair bit of chance, as you need to roll a d6 to determine if attraction abilities you get during your turn, and so you might not get all the abilities if you're unlucky on the die roll. If you roll a 1, you fail to visit any attractions, and if you roll a 6, you visit all of them. Having a balance of cards with lamps 2 to 5 lit up is crucial to be successful in this variant. There's just something satisfying and memorable about having a few dozen squirrel tokens in play and getting lucky and everyone gets to ride the merry-go-round, giving all of my squirrels horsemanship. Yes, my squirrel army is now promoted to cavalry, prepare yourselves for battle. My personal deck also utilizes elements from just about all of the strategies that we've mentioned here. I run a few of the cards to create the infinite squirrels, though since I'm not running any card tutors, I don't always draw into all the pieces. That does, in my mind, balance out the explosiveness of the combos with the luck of the draw. Building my deck in this way lets me emphasize the card draw resources in my deck, and so while I do have some powerful combo potential, it's not guaranteed that I will hit those strong cards. If you'd like to hear me discuss this deck in greater detail, I'll leave a link to both the video where I break this deck down, as well as links to the current deck list. At the end of the day, building a commander deck is your way to express yourself and show what you want to get out of a commander game. There's no right way to build a commander deck. I've been working on designing my personal Chatterfang in such a way that I can take groups of 20 cards or so out of the deck to swap out certain parts of the strategy to better fit certain playgroups. Some playgroups might play more powerful decks, and so I want to put my more stronger Aristocrat strategy in and take out some of the goofier attraction cards. I personally insist that all of the basic lands in this deck are the unsanctioned basics that have the hidden squirrels in the artwork, and I make it a bit out of attacking the player who finds the squirrel in the art last, and I think that this makes for a much more entertaining experience. I have them sleeved in Legion sleeves with the pumpkin spice guy, and I'm in the process of putting together potpourri scented of pumpkin spice to make the experience of playing against this deck as unhinged as humanly possible. This is an art form, not a science, and I think that this is my favorite thing about this game. Now, the reason I chose to do this video is because Bloomburrow is coming soon, and we will be getting our first modern support for squirrels since Chatterfang. We are actually getting an entire commander deck dedicated to this creature type, and while I am beyond excited to dive further into this theme, I'm also very curious as to what design space that we will see them explore. Currently, squirrels kind of fall into both a token and aristocrat strategies in terms of the deck types that best support them. What do you think we're going to get from Bloomburrow? Any predictions? Do stay tuned as we move closer to the set's release, as I will likely be covering the previews specific to that deck as they become public. But for now, that will wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed this extensive look at Chatterfang. If you did, likes and shares are among the best ways to help support the channel. If you're new here, join the Squirrel Squad by subscribing so you never miss a beat. I appreciate you all hanging out with me today, and as always, I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye!